So I've just got back from the most terrifying fucking excuse for a holiday of my entire life. It was meant to be great, a celebration of finally finishing uni after 5 long years. My boyfriend Zach and his best mate Blair booked a yacht for a few nights of cruising around the Great Barrier Reef. To be honest, I'm pretty sure Blair was the driving force behind the whole thing. The fact that he wanted to propose to Sonia, his girlfriend since high school, would have to be one of the worst kept secrets of all time. And Zach figured he must be taking this opportunity to pop the question. They even thought to book a skipper with the boat. An impressive decision for two guys who think they know everything about everything. Because in reality, their combined knowledge of anything to do with the water amounts to precisely dick all. Zach had never even seen the ocean until he moved to Brisbane at the start of his degree. So, I'd have been more than a little terrified if any part of a sailing yacht through coral reefs and island passages involved his hands being on the wheel. Of course, it would have been a shitload less terrifying than what actually happened. We landed in Cairns late one afternoon, planning to spend a night out on the town partying before chilling out and pretending to be sophisticated on a classy boat. The hotel on the waterfront was swanky enough that I almost didn't want to leave, happy to sit on the balcony and watch the constant party that is the main promenade. But the others were keen and thirsty, and soon enough, we were surrounded by backpackers at one of the local bars. Plenty of cold wine, and probably not enough food, if I'm completely honest, blurred the night and meant I woke up with a thumping head and the unsteady feeling that I might already be at sea. Thankfully, Zach had already wandered out on a coffee run, and the caffeine combined with a cool shower had me feeling almost human enough to head down to the marina and meet the boat. Now, I say yacht because that's what the website called it, but in reality, it was this really slick hybrid boat, part sailing vessel, part motor yacht. It even came with a stocked bar and kitchen, so we didn't have to drag a bunch of groceries around Cairns with us. How the boys afforded to book it, I've no idea, but I damn sure planned to enjoy it while it lasted. We met the captain, a surprisingly young guy named Dan. Before a quick tour of the boat and a lengthy but entertaining safety demonstration, Dan turned out to be a funny guy, and his demeanour definitely put me at ease straight away. Then it was bikinis and boardies as we lounged on the deck, watching the mainland slide away and heading towards the scattered islands and shoals of the Barrier Reef. The first leg of the journey was a short one, anchoring at nearby Fitzroy Island, where we sunbaked with glasses of bubbly before heading ashore for a few hours. There's a sea turtle rehab centre there, and I spent a good hour or so just watching them. The small tanks concerned me a little, but I knew these turtles were destined to be returned to the ocean when they might otherwise have died. So that cooled the tipsy wildlife warrior in me down. A few more glasses of bubbles on deck, and Sonia cooked up the most amazing whole fish for dinner. I've never experienced anything so idyllic, the sun setting over the mainland and the moon rising over a glass calm bay. I felt out of place. A girl from the less good side of Brisbane, sitting on a luxury boat in paradise. We laughed and joked and soaked it all in. The atmosphere and the romance. And when a very tipsy Zach dragged me back to our cabin, I certainly didn't resist. The next day, I woke as the sun came up. Just me and Captain Dan out on deck. He shot me a disarming smile as I blinked blearily in the brightening light. As captain of the boat, he obviously couldn't drink, and his perkiness compared to me showed clearly. "There's a pot of coffee in the kitchen. You look like you could use it." He was right. A few moments later, coffee in hand, I leant against the rail with him. We talked about what we did, just making small talk and being friendly. And he showed me a picture of his adorable little daughter, grinning proudly, when I commented on just how adorable I thought she was. "Hey, sea turtle!" He pointed out over the water suddenly as a dark shape popped up not 15 metres from the boat. In case you hadn't figured, I love turtles, and seeing a genuinely wild one brought a lame little squeal out of me. Dan laughed. If you like that, you're going to love the spot we're going to today. He took a long draught of his coffee, draining the mug. Plenty of sea turtles out in the lagoon. You can swim within a metre or so of them too. Not gonna lie, I was pumped. Captain Dan didn't lie either. Within a couple of hours, we arrived at his secret spot. Quite a small crescent moon-shaped reef that created a sandy lagoon. I could already see the turtles lazily coasting around the clear water, and I barely waited until the boat was moored up before leaping in with my snorkel. I spent hours swimming with them, long after everyone else got bored and retired to the boat for lunch. They were so close I could have touched them, and there were dozens of them around the lagoon at any one time. It might have just been the best day I'd ever had, which makes the horror that we experienced from then on even more troubling. For the late afternoon, Captain Dan proposed a trip to the out edge of the reef, where the coral drops away into massive depths. We wouldn't be able to snorkel for safety reasons, but the guys would be able to do some fishing before we headed back into the shallower water. So they naturally agreed. Sonia and I took the opportunity to shower off the salt, while Zach and Blair eagerly chatted to Dan. They had a ball, and even I decided to have a go and managed to pull in a few fish. Dan showed off by making us all sashimi, which was amazing, and we settled in as night fell to watch the breakers roll onto the reef under the moonlight. In the morning, I woke to chaos. Zach was in a panic, having a full go at Captain Dan on the little bridge. I rushed in to try and drag him away, fuming that he would carry on like that. But Sonia stepped in front of me with a worried look on her face. "We're lost, Ash." I frowned at her, not understanding what she was on about. "Lost? What do you mean lost?" She nodded out the window. "Look, the reef is gone. Nothing but water everywhere. And Dan says it's at least 2,000 metres deep. We woke up and we were out here. And Ash, the boat is dead. No motors, no radio. The only things that are working are the things that have their own power." Inside, Zach was getting angrier. Whatever Sonia said, I couldn't let things get out of hand, so I grabbed him by the arm and dragged him away. "What the fuck is wrong with you, Zach? Calm the fuck down." He looked at me like I'd lost the plot, not him. "Are you serious? This bloke's got us lost miles on the ocean, and he doesn't even have the sack to admit it. And you reckon belting the only guy who knows how to work this fucking boat is a good solution to that problem? Because that's what it looked like you were about to do." He looked like he wanted to argue, but I didn't give him the chance. "Captain Dan, what's actually happened?" Dan, for his part, looked like he was struggling to work it out himself. "I've honestly got no idea. I went to bed, and we were moored up on one of the Dad's old moorings inside the reef. This morning, I wake up, and we're suddenly in the open ocean. Mooring line's been cut. But if it got cut on the reef, it would have been smashed by the surf. We can't have drifted out against the surf. And we can't have drifted over the reef. And we can't have drifted as far as we look to have. Then there's this." He gestured to the GPS and sounder, which had its own power, so it could still operate in emergencies. "The bloody thing says we haven't moved, but at the same time, it says we're in 2,147 metres of water right now. Both of those things can't be true. Could the position be off? Like, if it stopped working, would it freeze on a position or something?" He shook his head. "If it stopped working, it wouldn't show a position. Maybe it's a bloody weird glitch. But I've never seen it before." Zach tried to interject, and I shut him up with a glare. I was just about to ask Dan about the engines when the boat, obviously drifting, came to a shuddering halt. "Bloody hell!" Dan looked aghast, racing out onto the deck. Zach's expression changed from rage into one of concern. "Did we hit something? Did we hit the reef? Do we need the life jackets?" I didn't know, so I just followed Dan. "Well, that's just not bloody possible," he said, leaning over the railing. "We've run a fucking ground. But didn't you say we're in like 2,000 metres of water? How can we run aground?" He shook his head. That's a good bloody question. But see for yourself. Sure enough, peering over the side, I could see the bottom only a few metres beneath us. It looked different though, covered in seaweed and thick kelp instead of coral. It didn't look like it belonged. On the bridge, we discovered that the sounder still said 2,147 metres. Clearly, it was stuffed, we thought. And Dan resorted to the old-fashioned method, a length of rope with a weight on the end. We figured the depth was about 5 to 8 metres, but it was hard to say. So we just grabbed a long length of rope out of the hold. The rope went straight through the sea floor. Well, that's what it seemed like. We all agreed that we could clearly see the bottom, yet we let out easily 1,000 feet of rope without ever feeling it. If we weren't stuck fast, I'd have thought the image of swaying weed and white sand was a shared delusion or something. We could even see the rope, arrows straight and descending into the apparent depths, not pooling on the bottom. That was when I really started to feel afraid, because I just couldn't understand it at all. How could we be stuck on the sea floor, able to see it, but still apparently be in deep water, leaving the others to debate the sea floor and whether it was an illusion or a hologram or whatever? I climbed up to the sitting area and tried to look for landmarks. It wasn't much higher than the deck, but it gave me a slightly better view. I quickly noted something weird. "Guys, shut up for a minute," I called down to the others. "Do you see that?" They looked at me oddly, following my outstretched arm and going wide-eyed. The sky, at least the horizon and immediately above it, was more green than blue. Blair turned to me, although I think his question was aimed at whatever power might be listening more than any of us. "Where the hell are we?" Sleep didn't come easily that night. The sun going through that green haze made for a sick sunset that made us all uneasy, and obviously being marooned fuck knows where didn't help. I hardly had any appetite and went to bed for nothing else than some sort of comfort not long after darkness fell. The sky, normally black, had an eerie red tinge without the sun out. At least in the cabin, I could feel myself, you know. I suppose I eventually did doze off at least a little, because something woke me in the dead of night. My watch said about 4 a.m, for whatever that seemed to be worth given our situation. I couldn't work out what had woken me up, but then I heard it again, clear as day. Someone was out on the deck. At first, I figured it must have been Captain Dan or one of the others. Maybe they were looking for answers, or just couldn't sleep and needed some air. I even got up to go check it out, resigning myself to not sleeping for the rest of the night. Obviously, I probably wouldn't be writing this if that wasn't a huge fucking mistake. I padded softly into the main lounge area, catching sight of a figure on the back deck, definitely large enough to be Captain Dan. My heart stopped the instant I noticed the second figure though, because it climbed on board over the back of the boat. I could clearly see water sluicing off whoever had come on board as I threw myself instinctively onto the couch and out of sight. The first figure could pass for Dan, but the second one was the same rough size and build, and neither of the boys matched it. Someone else had climbed onto the boat. As my eyes adjusted and I sneaked another look over the top of the lounge, I realised they weren't someone at all. They moved inhumanely in a way I can't quite describe, like their joints were all different. They bent in places people don't bend, and their heads stayed oddly level as the rest of their body bobbed up and down. The two figures moved almost silently now they had climbed aboard, gliding towards the glass doors. Now that they were closer, I could see more of their features. Completely hairless, their skin was mottled, black and something lighter, maybe blue, although it was hard to tell the colour in the dark. It looked almost like dolphin skin, glistening smooth in the moonlight. 4 solid black eyes sat on a flat face, 2 large ones, mirrored by a set of smaller eyes immediately below. A strange mouth capped off a terrifying face, almost like it was underslung with too much skin or something. One of them reached a webbed hand out and touched the glass, and I couldn't help myself. I screamed and everything went very pear-shaped, very fucking fast. The creatures at the door flinched and then let out this awful gargling shriek. The odd mouths flew open, flaps of skin throwing teeth and mandibles wide. I once saw this hilarious Facebook video of a pair of fish, fringe heads or something, fighting, and these things had mouths that reminded me of that, except very much not hilarious. Especially when the first creature smashed the glass door. I bolted for the corridor that led to the cabins as two sets of footsteps came towards me from back there. Zach and Dan. "Move! Shut the fucking door!" They looked more scared of me than anything else, but that changed when they saw what was behind me. "Holy fuck, Ash," Zach shouted, useful as ever. I flew through the small door and skidded, trying to turn and close it behind me. Dan and Zach, to their credit, kept coming and slammed the door shut, putting their weight into it, as the monsters outside smacked into it and tried to push it open. Blair and Sonia finally poked their heads out, and I screamed at them to find something to barricade the door. The boys were strong, but the creatures were winning. Suddenly, Blair shouted at them to get out of the way, showing strength I didn't realise he had. He was pushing a heavy metal cabinet towards the door. Zach and Dan scrambled out of the way, just in time. The door latch holding long enough for Blair to block any movement and jam the cabinet into the narrow hallway. We were safe for the moment, but on the flip side, we were trapped. There was an emergency exit towards the bow, and we could still get below deck. But with whatever the fuck those things were on the boat, we weren't going outside any time soon. Captain Dan ushered us all into mine and Zach's cabin, where we hunkered down to catch our breath. Outside, the porthole in the door shattered, but a quick glimpse showed that nothing more than a searching arm could get through. Zach looked at me aghast. "What the fuck are those things, Ash?" Pfft, like I should know. I don't fucking know. I woke up, heard a noise, went to check it out, and boom, fucking fish face and friend. All I know is they came out of the water. Well, what do we do? I felt like saying something very sarcastic, but Dan cut me off. There's not a lot we can do right now. Calming down is about it. 'Cause it's no bloody good carrying on like dead shits. Right at that moment, there came a series of thumps and a sound like claws on hardwood floor. For a split second, I thought the creatures had somehow got through the door, but the smashing of the cabin porthole heralded even worse news. There were more of them, and they were climbing up the hull. We all let out a series of screams, yelps, and vicious swear words before scrambling across the hall into another cabin. Unfortunately, a few minutes later, the same thing happened. Then another portal shattered further down. They were all over the hull, and we were under siege. The not-so-bad news was that they couldn't immediately get in. Although, there wasn't really any good news. Zach and Blair started dreaming up rubbish plans that sound more like panic than anything else. So, I ignored them and turned to Dan. "Should we get further below decks?" He looked unsure. "I mean, we're probably harder to get out down there. Course, these things sink the bloody boat, we'll be drowned like rats. I think if these things sink the boat, even if we could get off, we'd be torn to pieces before we could fucking drown." He gave a grim smile. Fair point. Just then, a series of thwack sounds echoed through the cabin, and an arm retracted from the busted porthole. Opposite the porthole, a group of strange, bony projectiles were embedded in the wall, glistening with a dark slime that probably would have done us no good if it got into our bloodstream. "What the fuck? These things can shoot shit at us? How is that fighting fair?" Dan nodded at me. "Below decks might be a good idea, I reckon." He crawled towards the door, mindful of the latest danger, and we all followed one by one. Down the corridor, the creatures at the door kept up their assault, joined by the thumping and clicking of others all over the boat. At least below decks, there were no portholes. Captain Dan waited until the last of us got down the stairs and then slid a cover over the top of the staircase, locking it in place. The others looked up at him expectantly. "Well, what now?" Sonia whispered. Dan shrugged. "Hope they lose interest. I mean, we're pretty short on options here." Zach snorted at that. "Hope they lose interest? What the hell kind of plan is that? We need to do something." "Sit down, Zach. Seriously." I bit back. "We don't even know how many there are. They're bigger and stronger than we are. And they apparently shoot fucking poison darts out of fuck knows where. We've got a few flares and a boat hook. It's not exactly an even playing field." The silence from the others was deafening. And I thought Zach was going to blow up, but eventually he sighed into feet and sat down. "It's not perfect, but what can we do? Maybe if they can't get in, they'll go away. I mean, I'd love to say we did something heroic, that we fought them off with a flare tied to a boat hook, or our bare hands and sheer moxie or whatever. But the truth is, we sat and we waited." For another couple of hours, the thumping and the shrieking continued. As suddenly as it all seemed to kick off, though, it stopped, with a series of heavy splashes. A few minutes later, the boat started to move on the swell again, like it was free of the bottom. We all looked at each other expectantly, but it took a full hour or more before any of us made a move. By then, the sun had obviously risen, illuminating the edges of the door that slid over the stairs. It had been silent for about 2 hours, and we decided that we could risk a look. Dan crept up the stairs first, followed by Zach and then me. Sunlight streamed in through the portholes, and the only sounds were the surf and the creaking of the boat as it moved. A seagull cawed, and we all jumped before I realised exactly what I heard. "Was that—" Captain Dan nodded cautiously, heading over to a porthole and risking a look. "What? Are you bloody shitting me?" He stormed out of the cabin and towards the door to the main lounge area, shifting the cabinet just enough to climb over and get through. Confused, I started after him, only getting more confused when I heard him roar with laughter as I climbed through the door. We were back on the reef, moored right where we had been only about 48 hours earlier. Seagulls wheeled erratically overhead, and the sky wasn't green. Honestly, if not for the smashed windows and the damage to the boat, I'd have wondered if I dreamt everything. The whole weird scene had lasted maybe 24 hours, and the actual attack about 3 or 4. But it felt like a lifetime. Also, the boat started first go. I've got no idea what happened, or how, or why. I've got no idea why it ended so suddenly. Did we travel to some other dimension? Was it some sort of Bermuda Triangle deal? Aliens? Tony Abbott? I haven't got a clue. All I know is, if you're out on the ocean and you somehow find yourself aground in deep water, or the sky goes green and weird on you, it might be an idea to hide somewhere. Definitely don't go out on the deck. Actually, maybe just do what I'm doing. Avoid the ocean forever. That seems like a good idea.